How do you write effective red herrings? Mystery fans love trying to solve the puzzle, and they also love getting to the end and being thoroughly surprised. A good mystery novel shouldn't be a straight line. There need to be some red herrings along the way to produce that really satisfying, wait, what moment at the end. Of course, at the same time, your red herrings do need to tie into the main storyline of the story to make them more satisfying. In today's video, we're going to talk all about red herrings in mystery and thriller novels, including the history of the term red herring, why readers like red herrings, and how you can write them effectively. Hi, my name is Jackie. I am an author, and my debut historical mystery novel, The Cloak and Dagger Club, is coming out with an imprint of Penguin Random House in 2026. This is the new episode in my series Mystery Trope Talk, where I dissect popular mystery tropes. Before we go any further, it's important to discuss what red herring even means. A red herring is, simply put, a false clue. It's a piece of information meant to mislead the reader and distract them from the real solution. It's the character who looks awfully suspicious but isn't guilty. It's the cryptic clue that points to the wrong suspect. Or the motive that makes perfect sense until it all falls apart at the end. One thing that I was curious about when I was planning this video is where the term red herring even comes from, because when you think about it, it's kind of a strange term. And considering that the term red herring has been referenced in novels by classic crime authors like Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers, it's clearly been a term in the mystery genre for a very long time. And I discovered that the term red herring used in this context actually dates back to an article from the 1800s. In 1807, an English writer and political commentator named William Cobbett discussed a hunting anecdote from his boyhood. Obviously, hunting historically has been a very popular sport with the English elite, and so when Cobbett was young, they used to go out with their hunting dogs. However, they didn't want the hunting dogs to hunt down the rabbits on the estate. And so, what he and his friends would do was drag a herring fish, because herring has a very strong smell, and that way the dogs would be distracted by the scent of the fish and not chase the rabbits. Cobbett wrote, quote, "We used to drag a red herring tied to a string 4 or 5 miles till we got to a point whence we were pretty sure the hunters would not return to the spot where they had been thrown off." So, just like these red herrings were used to distract the hunting dogs from the real prey, a red herring is used to distract a mystery reader from the real solution. So, why do readers like red herrings? What makes them so psychologically satisfying? First of all, there is a joy in being tricked. Mystery novels are like puzzles, and the reader wants to be able to piece out the mystery, pick up on this and that piece here or there. So, when a red herring is cleverly employed and they get that feeling of being outsmarted by the author, it can be very satisfying. You want the red herring to be intellectually stimulating, but it also can't come out of left field either, because then it doesn't feel fair. You want to match wits with your reader, not pull the wool over their eyes. Red herrings also keep your readers turning the pages and thoroughly engaged in your book, because when they have all these different puzzle pieces, it keeps them guessing, it keeps them wondering. If you had a purely linear progression where every single clue was leading us to the real killer and every single thing was all tied to one character, that could make the reading experience a little boring, because then it might be obvious who the guilty party is. Another really fun thing about a red herring is that it rewards rereads, because when a reader goes back and rereads your book with this new information in mind, they can now see all of the clues and misdirects through a new light, giving them a renewed perspective and an appreciation for your abilities as the mystery writer. Red herrings keep readers engaged and guessing, and red herrings can come in many different forms. Next up, we're going to talk about some different types of red herrings using real examples from literature. If I am discussing a book that you haven't read yet and you don't want to be spoiled, you can use the timestamps down below to jump to the next section. However, I intentionally picked very famous books, so hopefully most of you have read them already. Now, a red herring doesn't necessarily need to be a physical thing. It can also be a person or a piece of information that has been distorted. A false clue is probably the most obvious and most common red herring type. This is a clue that you assume means one thing, but ends up meaning something different or just being completely irrelevant. For example, let's discuss A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the first story featuring his famous detective Sherlock Holmes. In this book, Holmes, Watson, and the Scotland Yard detectives are at a murder scene when they discover the word Rache scrawled on the wall. Rache. Police assume that the killer was attempting to write the woman's name Rachel, Rachel, and just didn't have time to write the last letter. However, Sherlock Holmes points out that Rach, which I may be pronouncing totally wrong, I apologize, is actually the German word for revenge, hinting at the killer's potential motive and nationality. However, upon further reflection, Holmes determines that the word is not written the way a real German speaker would have written it. Therefore, it is a misdirect on the killer's part. This is a red herring because the killing has nothing to do with any Germans or any women named Rachel. But what's also interesting about this red herring is that we see Inspector Lestrade and Sherlock Holmes both interpret it in entirely different ways, either of which could have been correct. It could have meant revenge, or it could have meant Rachel. A really effective mystery writing tool is to present a clue and have the clue be something that could be interpreted in multiple different ways. Perhaps initially your detective thinks that it indicates one thing, and then later they get new information that tells them, no, actually, I interpreted this wrong. This is what it actually means. Additionally, sometimes characters themselves can be red herrings, and I think the perfect example of this is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. In this book, the character of Snape himself is effectively a sort of red herring because throughout the book, Harry and the readers are looking at him as a potential villain, and that effectively disguises the true villain. And honestly, it's totally understandable why Harry and the readers wouldn't trust Snape. He's not a very pleasant person, to say the least. He's very mean, he seemingly doesn't like Harry at all, and he constantly bullies his students. You can totally understand why Harry wouldn't trust him. And when Harry sees Snape mumbling to himself at a Quidditch match where Harry himself is injured, it seems like Snape was legitimately trying to use magic to hurt or kill Harry. However, at the end of the book, when we find out that a different Hogwarts professor is actually in league with Lord Voldemort, we are able to look at that scene at the Quidditch match in an entirely new light. Harry saw Snape mumbling a spell under his breath and assumed that Snape was trying to harm him, but plot twist, Snape was actually saying that spell to protect him. And this really works as a red herring because it totally makes sense why people would be looking at Snape as a potential culprit. And yet, at the end, when we have this new information, we are able to look back at that moment and now see it in an entirely different light. Making a character look like they could be suspicious and then later revealing new information that casts our opinion of them in a different light is very effective, especially when you are able to take moments that were interpreted one way and now reveal that actually they had a different motivation that equally makes sense. A third example of a really effective red herring that I want to mention here is having some evidence that is actually tied to a separate crime or separate plot thread. Most readers will make a correlation between different pieces of evidence in the book, so if you are able to reveal that actually this piece of evidence is not at all evidence, it actually pertains to something else entirely, that will surprise most readers. So for an example, let's talk about Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. In this book, the wealthy Lynette Doyle is murdered on a cruise ship going down the Nile River. When Lynette's body is discovered, it is also mentioned that a very valuable string of pearls that she owned is missing from her room. Her body is in her room, the pearls are missing from that same room, so therefore it seems like potentially the killer is the one who took the pearls. And based on that information, you might assume that whoever killed Lynette has some sort of money-related motive. However, it turns out that the pearls have nothing to do with the murder. Another character who didn't commit the crime stole the pearls that same night, but the killer was someone else entirely. These were two entirely separate instances committed by two different characters. The pearls are irrelevant to the murder, however, they are still resolved because we do find out who stole them and why. And that makes them a very effective red herring while still having a resolution in the narrative. Now, that is actually a great transition to my tips for writing red herrings, but first, if you are enjoying this video and finding it helpful, please do give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more from me. I post new videos every week. Also, remember to hit the bell if you want to be notified every time I post a new upload. So, for my tips, one important thing that I want you to remember is that red herrings should always serve a purpose in the story, and they should not be extraneous things that are just randomly mentioned and then never come back into play. If, say, in Death on the Nile, Agatha Christie mentioned that Lynette Doyle's pearls were missing, but then we never found out who took them, that would be a really annoying red herring because it would have served no purpose in the narrative other than just to mislead readers. So, tip number one for writing red herrings is to treat each suspect in your story as their own subplot. The main suspects in your story should serve some sort of narrative purpose. If they don't, then what is their point in the story? Treat each suspect effectively as their own subplot, giving each of them a potential motive and a moment in the narrative where they are either A, excluded from suspicion, or B, fingered as the killer. Let's say you have a character in your book who is acting very suspicious. You could just reveal somebody else as the killer and never explain why this other person was acting suspicious, but that would be deeply unsatisfying because then there would be no in-universe explanation for their behavior. And then you'll leave your reader scratching their head at the end wondering, why was Betty being so weird in that scene? We never found out why she was acting like that. That doesn't really make sense. So instead, if Betty is acting suspicious, let's have a moment later on where we find out, yeah, she didn't kill anyone, but she's been having a clandestine affair with the next door neighbor, and she was worried that being questioned in this murder was going to potentially expose her secret relationship. Perhaps a cigarette butt was dropped near the crime scene, and we discover that that cigarette butt belonged to Joe, but actually Joe wasn't the killer. He was just near the scene of the crime earlier in the day because he was secretly stealing money from the deceased. This way, you're casting suspicion onto these characters, but also finding explanations for their behavior. These red herrings still come back in the end and can misdirect the reader while still serving a point. And tip 2 is also connected to this. Do not leave loose threads, you guys. It is so deeply unsatisfying to me when I'm reading a book and there is a plot thread that just never comes back in the end. We never find out what was up with that. A red herring shouldn't just be a dead end. It should have some sort of point in the narrative, and you can't say the point is to distract the reader. There has to be a moment where it comes back around with an explanation so the reader can say to themselves, okay, so that's what that was all about. For an example, I once read a thriller where there was a character who was a sort of mysterious street artist, like a Banksy sort of figure, I think. And this person, we didn't know their real identity, what their real name was, and they had an obsession with the main character. This subplot did add to the creepy atmosphere of the book, and I found myself wondering, okay, which one of the characters in this book is going to be revealed as this mysterious artist at the end? But we get to the end of the book, and we never find out who this person was. This plot thread had no resolution, and it existed simply to make the reader think that it might have something to do with the solution. But then it never circles back around in the end. This was problematic to me because this plot thread had no resolution. It was left open ended, so really the only point of it being in the narrative was to mislead me. If perhaps we had found out another one of the characters in the book was disguising themselves as this artist and they had a real reason to be obsessed with the main character, then even though it was a red herring and didn't tie into the central mystery, it still would have been satisfying because my questions would have been answered. Tip number 3 is make sure that you don't overdo it on the red herrings. You need to have some in your book to make the story a little more difficult to solve and not too obvious. But at the same time, if you put a ton of red herrings into your book and so many clues that don't lead to the actual killer, it can start to be confusing for the reader or even frustrating. Let's go back to my earlier example when I said perhaps a character named Joe snuck into the murder scene earlier in the day because he had a gambling addiction and so he was stealing money from the deceased. Now, that is a good red herring because it's going to cast suspicion onto Joe, but later we're going to find out there's actually a totally different explanation for his actions. Now, if in that same time period, Elizabeth also went into the room because she stole one of the victim's evening gowns, and Steve went in there because he's having an affair with the deceased, and Martha went in there because she is a kleptomaniac, now you're getting very overwhelming. There are too many people who were all in there for their own reasons. It's starting to get unbelievable, and your reader may be thinking, how many people went into this bedroom in a 2-hour period? And none of them saw each other? You don't want your reader to feel overwhelmed, and you also want to make sure that you have a manageable number of red herrings so that you, the writer, can successfully resolve them all. And you also want to make sure that while you are giving red herrings, you are also giving real clues that are going to eventually lead to the real solution. If you have 25 red herrings, but only 3 real clues, that is going to be incredibly frustrating for the reader. You want to have a nice balance between the two. Another technique that I think can be really satisfying is to have one of your red herrings actually introduce a real clue. So perhaps when Joe went into the bedroom to steal the money, on the way out, he happened to stop in the doorway and he saw somebody slip into one of the other rooms down the hall that they weren't supposed to be in. And then perhaps that person that Joe saw, that's going to lead you to the real killer. So therefore, Joe's red herring subplot, even though he's not the killer and that clue connected to him didn't lead to a conviction, he is telling you a piece of information that is going to contribute to the ultimate solution. And tip number 4. Okay, I kind of gave this one away because I referenced it earlier with Sherlock Holmes. But tip number 4, have the characters in your story misinterpret a real clue. This, I think, is a really great trick that can be incredibly effective in a story. Instead of using a fake clue, take a real clue, but disguise it so that the characters and the readers are going to interpret it in a different way. This way, you are showing that your main character is fallible and you're misleading the reader without lying to them. And that's very important because you never want to intentionally lie to your reader. Instead, you are just being very clever and preying on their assumptions so that when they find out the truth, they'll smack themselves in the forehead and be like, oh my God, why did I assume? I should have thought about this. So, for an example of this, we're going to talk about the film Knives Out. In this film, Marta is trying to solve the death of the famous mystery writer Harlan Thrombey. And at one point, she wants to talk to Fran, who had previously worked for this wealthy family. When Marta discovers Fran, who has been drugged and tied up, Fran says something to her, and Marta interprets Fran's word as you. However, we later find out that you is actually not what Fran said. There is another character in this film played by Chris Evans who goes by his middle name, Ransom, but his first name, we learn, is actually Hugh, Hugh. Hugh sounds a lot like you. And that is actually what Fran said to Marta. She was implicating Ransom as the real killer. Because while he predominantly went by his middle name, there were some people in the family who always called him Hugh. And so what Fran was actually trying to say is that the killer is Hugh, aka Ransom. It's a really genius red herring because it recontextualizes this moment. And it is supported because earlier in the story, we learned that Ransom's real first name was Hugh, and there were some people in his life who called him that. Had we not known that was his first name and that was revealed at the end, well, then it wouldn't have been fair because the viewer wouldn't have had a chance to figure this out. And tip number 5 for writing effective red herrings, I like to call this the golden rule of mystery writing. Always play fair. I know, every mystery writer wants to be able to surprise their audience, but you have to give them a chance to guess who done it. If not a single member of your audience, not a single one, guessed who the killer was, then I hate to break it to you, but you did not have enough clues in the book. You didn't play fair. There should be some people who are going to guess your killer because that just means that they're really smart and that you put enough information in for them to put things together. The trick is to give your reader all the information they need to solve the mystery, but use your cleverness to disguise the truth with red herrings, misdirects, clever wordplay. When a reader gets to the end of your book, you want them to say, "Oh my God, I should have seen it coming." That is the moment that makes reading a mystery so rewarding. If they're sitting there saying, "Well, I didn't see that coming, but I don't know how I could have," then it's just not going to be as satisfying for them. You want them to be able to look back in hindsight and now see how everything came together, and they didn't realize it until this moment. And there will be some people who are going to guess who the killer is. I guess who the murderer is in almost every mystery and thriller book that I read because I am a mystery writer. I know the tricks, and I just read a crap ton of mysteries and thrillers. But that's okay. I would rather get to the end of a book and feel like, I guessed who it was and I see all the clues that the author put in the book. I feel like they were using really good techniques that I just happened to pick up on. I would much rather have that feeling than get to the end and be like, what? If you watched this all the way through to the end, drop a detective emoji in the comment section. And why don't you check out this video where I talk about how I predict whodunit in almost every single mystery novel that I read. Thank you so much for being here today. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss my next episode, and let me know in the comment section what mystery trope I should talk about next. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.